During the last few weeks, leading up to the start of the 2026 season, rumors kept circulating about Aston Martin. Rumors that they had a scary car, some said that the engine fit like a glove, that Aston Martin would take a step forward this year, and so on. And really, this was what was expected, that with Lawrence Stroll's team and his millionaire investments and facilities, the arrival of the genius Adrian Newey and Honda as the engine supplier. After having won 4 drivers and constructors titles in the last 5 years, it led people to believe that Aston Martin should take a step forward this season. But once the cars hit the track, the result was an absolute disaster. Many of us thought that something like what happened with McLaren Honda in 2015 was impossible to happen again, but not only did it happen again, this Aston Martin Honda partnership is an even bigger disaster. The car is not only slow, but it also has serious reliability problems, and it turns out that due to the vibrations, it's even dangerous for its drivers. This made many people wonder what the hell happened here. How is it that a team that was expected to at least be leaders of the midfield ended up with a car that can't even finish races and is even worse than the Cadillac that entered the category for the first time this year? Well, in this video, that's what we're going to try to go over. A review of the decisions that led to the highly anticipated and long-awaited Aston Martin Honda project ending in the resounding failure that it is, at least in this initial stage of the 2026 season. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the video analysis of the Aston Martin Honda disaster. Alright, to better understand this story, which takes place in February 2026, we first have to go back to the year 2018 to fully understand everything related to this failure. And in 2018, that year, the Force India Formula One team ended up falling into financial insolvency, which forced the team to be sold in order to safeguard the structure. This is the exact point where the team is bought by Lawrence Stroll, who is a Canadian businessman that acquired the remains of the dying Force India to have his own racing team in Formula One. Where, I don't think I have to mention it, but I'll do it anyway, Lawrence Stroll is the father of Lance Stroll. And after taking over the team during 2019 and 2020, he named them Racing Point, achieving some podiums along the way and the victory at the Sakir Grand Prix thanks to the Mexican driver Sergio Checo Perez. But in that same 2020, Lawrence Stroll acquired shares of the Aston Martin brand, the British luxury car company, with which he was able to ensure that starting in 2021, the team became the official Aston Martin structure within Formula One, showing signs that this man was serious with the intention of sooner or later having a car to win world championships for both drivers and constructors. This is regarding the first main character. The second is Honda Racing, the sports division of the Japanese company, which entered Formula One in 2015 with a hybrid power unit, teaming up with the McLaren team, trying to revive that very successful partnership from the late 80s and early 90s. The result? A disaster. For 3 years, long 3 years, McLaren was stuck at the bottom in terms of competitiveness, mainly because Entente 5 was presented as the best in history. The third Formula One engine in 2015 was introduced as historic, any other engine on the grid. So, with that tremendous lack of competitiveness, this partnership came to an end in 2020. But since in the end, Red Bull was very upset with the lack of competitiveness of the Renault power unit, whom they accused of being the reason they couldn't achieve success, the Austrian team decided to give the Japanese brand a chance at redemption. And in 2018, they signed a collaboration agreement for Honda to supply engines to the Toro Rosso team, and if that partnership worked, in 2019 they would go on to power the Red Bull team, and that collaboration was a success. Honda began to show very good competitiveness, to the point that in 2019 they achieved 6 podiums throughout the year and secured 3 victories with Max Verstappen. A complete 180-degree turnaround from what had been seen with McLaren since 2015. However, in 2020 a decision was made that would be critical for the disaster that was about to happen 6 years later. And due to the pandemic, the Japanese parent company decided that they would leave Formula One as engine suppliers after the 2021 season. To focus on the future, they shifted resources to develop electrification technologies, aiming to create street cars with zero carbon emissions. Therefore, 2021 would theoretically be Honda's last year in Formula One, since supposedly the engines no longer fit what Honda was looking for as a company for the future. But this announcement came at a terrible time because in 2021, both Red Bull and Honda found themselves involved in one of the most extraordinary seasons in Formula One, where by the end of it, they won the Drivers' Championship. However, this left Red Bull in a completely uncomfortable situation because now they didn't have a power unit for 2022, Mercedes didn't want to give them one, and they didn't want to go back to being powered by Renault. But in the end, Honda ended up selling them the intellectual property of their engines so they could keep using them with support from the world. In fact, since 2022, these power units would be frozen in terms of their development. And that's how Red Bull came to own the Honda engines from 2022 to 2025, although now they were owned by a new structure called Red Bull Powertrains. This is exactly the point in the story where Red Bull would begin its journey to become a constructor team that would create its own power units. They had the intellectual property of Honda, they took over the facilities that the Japanese brand had in Milton Keynes, and a large part of the staff who worked on those engines became part of the recently formed Red Bull Powertrains team. However, things would take a 180-degree turn in August of that 2022, where it was approved that starting in 2026, Formula One would have power units focused on giving more relevance to the electric component. Engines whose power would be split 50-50 between the electric components and the combustion components, which was much more in line with what Honda was looking for in their vehicles. And in this story, now we have to move to December of 2022 because that's the month when Honda regretted their decision and decided to stay in Formula One as an engine supplier. Interested in this story is the Japanese brand receives its first setback. Well, Red Bull already had its structure to create its own power units, and they decided to move forward as independent engine manufacturers since they already had most of Honda's original staff plus other talents from teams like Mercedes. Going back to Aston Martin, since they entered Formula One in 2021, I'm referring exclusively to Aston Martin as a brand. Their ambitions were very big, but the team still lacked independence. Well, not only were they powered by Mercedes, but they also bought several of their parts, components, and gearbox, which limited them a lot. Between 2021 and 2023, they had already managed to get some podiums, and in fact, in 2023, the team's competitiveness was very good. However, since Honda no longer powers Red Bull, there would be the possibility for those engines to go to a new customer. And that's where Lawrence thought that having the exclusive backing of a manufacturer was the last key he needed to be able to fight for championships in Formula One. So they negotiated with the Japanese manufacturer, and in May of 2023, Aston Martin announced that Honda would join them as their engine supplier starting in 2026, to be their exclusive supplier of power units, in a collaboration with those responsible for the power unit that had won the Drivers' Championships from 2021 to 2024 and the Constructors' Championships in 2022 and 2023. However, Honda admitted from the beginning that this partnership with Aston Martin would be very different from what the partnership with Red Bull was, since in many aspects they would have to start working from scratch in this new stage. And this was the exact point where things were already simmering, the disaster that would come 3 years later, which would mark a historic embarrassment for both companies. At this point, they didn't realize it, and the announcement seemed unremarkable, though it could mark the start of something historic. At this point, it's making history, even if for the wrong reasons. After losing their facilities in Europe, Honda started working in Japan on their new power units. But this is where the problem arises, since the Japanese brand began working with a group of near-complete rookies. Since the best engineers responsible for the 2021 power units stayed with Red Bull, and those who weren't hired by Red Bull ended up in other projects, as Adrian Newey mentions, and some even ended up making solar panels. Therefore, the team that would design these new power units would have Koji Watanabe as the leader, but a staff made up of almost 70% rookies and only a small group of just 30%. He was part of that team that developed Red Bull's power units in 2020 and 2021. The serious problem with all of this is that Aston Martin didn't know about it. At this point in the story, the chief executive officer of the Aston Martin team was Andy Cowell, who made several visits to the factory in Japan and during these visits kept praising the abilities of the staff they had. What Martin? Aston Martin? What Aston Martin? Martin? Was the Japanese brand doing? Although by 2025 the British team already had a new state-of-the-art factory, a new simulator, and they were about to debut a new wind tunnel. In addition to hiring highly talented personnel like Enrico Cardile, who came from Ferrari and would be the new technical director of the team, and the super high-profile signing of the aerodynamics genius Adrian Newey. And while the team was greatly strengthening itself with such talented and remained in this equation was how Honda was going to do it. And for a while, the rumors weren't all that good. It was said that Honda had countless problems, that their engine wasn't all that powerful, and so on and so forth. Rumors that kept intensifying, making the people at Aston Martin very nervous, who finally, 3 years after signing their partnership with them, decided that in November 2025, it was time to travel directly to Japan to check the truth of these rumors. And this group was led by Andy Cowell, Adrian Newey, and Lawrence Stroll, and this was the exact moment when Aston Martin realized the serious problem they were in from that point on. Because that's when they realized that the staff working on the power units had little to do with the people who were at Red Bull. And many of you might be wondering right now why Honda did such a thing. Well, the Japanese brand has a different work philosophy compared to the rest of the engine manufacturers, if you want to put it that way. They bet on young talent to develop their projects so they can learn, and once they've reached maturity, move them to other more important positions within Honda's automotive structure. Therefore, most of the team were young people without previous experience in developing Formula One power units, and this took Aston Martin by surprise. Clearly, by that point, they could already see the disaster that was about to happen. However, at this point in the story, it was already too late to change engines, so Honda and Aston Martin headed into the 2000 preseason. The power unit has a serious vibration problem that destroys the car's batteries and makes driving the single-seater a complete torture. During preseason, they suffered constant breakdowns and failures that greatly limited the team's mileage, and to date, 2 races have passed and they haven't been able to finish either one. Because either the car breaks down or it vibrates so much that it's impossible for the drivers to handle without, according to the team itself, causing them permanent nerve damage. As you can imagine, this led to a wave of back-and-forth statements between Honda and Aston Martin, where on one hand the British revealed that Honda had a team practically from the moment they moved, from the moment they went out on track. The magnitude of the problem until November of that year, which was when they visited the factory in Japan, implying that Honda had deceived them and that if they had known that information from the beginning, they wouldn't have signed with them. Honda, for its part, didn't stay silent. And they blamed Newey directly, saying that ever since he joined the Aston Martin team, he started requesting many changes that affected the original product Honda had, since Newey asked them to make the engine narrower. And according to Honda officials, they changed the peripheral equipment of the power unit to the attachment to the chassis and had to place the battery on 2 levels. As if they wanted to hold the British engineer responsible, saying that part of this disaster is his fault because of so many changes he had requested in such a short time. Be that as it may, the disaster had already happened. It came out of the oven and resulted in the ridicule we're seeing today. A team with zero competitiveness, serious reliability problems, and where the only thing left for them is to almost pray halfway through the season to find solutions to get out of the loop they're currently in. For their part, Honda has said that they will start an urgent round of hiring to attract as many engineers as possible from that 2020 and 2021 group which was not bought by Red Bull, and that a large part of their resources will be moved to solve this problem. The thing is, the problem is very serious and it will definitely require a lot of time and resources to find a solution that puts an end to this huge embarrassment that both the British team and the Japanese brand are suffering from once again. To sum up, the Aston Martin disaster can be boiled down to 2 particular things: an endless series of decision changes by Honda that ruined the huge work group they had in 2020, and a complete lack of concern from Aston Martin to supervise that everything was going as it should. All the flood of decisions made by Honda, from the announcement of their exit in 2020 to their return in 2023 to create these new power units, was what ultimately triggered the disaster. But also, once again, they underestimated the challenge of Formula One, wanting to put inexperienced personnel in charge, thinking that with a small group of experts, they could lead the development of a competitive power unit. It's a philosophy that, yes, has worked for Honda, but it's very difficult for it to work in Formula One. And again, the progress is ridiculous, at a level even worse than that McLaren-Honda disaster of 2015. I know that many people, knowing this, have put Aston Martin in the role of martyrs, so the disaster is very serious. But nothing could be further from the truth. For a structure that aims to be top level in Formula One, it's ridiculous and shameful that during these 2.5 years, they never properly supervised what Honda was doing with their power units. And the worst part is when Andy Cowell blatantly lied to people saying, wow, the Honda team is doing such a great job, when internally everything was a disaster. This shows that Andy Cowell's management as the team's chief executive officer was disastrous, since he failed to notice something as fundamentally basic as the fact that the Honda team members were complete rookies. It's ridiculously unprofessional for a team that aims to be world champion not to have thought of supervising their partner more closely to realize early on what was going to happen and try to fix it in time. So they are hardly poor victims and bear a large part of the responsibility, because even though Honda caused this disaster, their total lack of supervision prevented this from coming to light. Unfortunately for them, it's too late to change power units, so they must now work together to escape this hell quickly. Although it's clear that both parties involved are not happy with each other, only by working together might they be able to find a way out of this. But as I told you, regardless of whether they find solutions, this will take time and resources. And that only means that both Aston Martin and Honda have a long, tortuous, and very difficult road ahead of them to get out of the hell they got themselves into.